So I thought I'd do something a little different from what I've done before, where I'm kind of going to teach, but really it's the egoic process and the ego's process. Like if you look at it from chronological, historical, whatever kind of view, doesn't matter. We're looking at all the planets. Well, planets, whatever we have, whatever comes naturally. I feel like it just comes more. Whatever I kind of like vomit out, and that's going to be what the insights are, right? So today, though, there were several things that came through, and it was just like, okay, that's interesting, because as you grow into not just astrology, but like as a person, right? You are a human being. You're part of nature. It's part of the growth process, right? So, from the whole, like, if you look at our solar system, the reason why it's called even solar system is because it's focused on the sun, and the sun is always your ego. It's your identity, it's yourself. It's identification with things. It's tied into the actual ego because it's identification of the form. What the eyes see, what the hands, what the skin touches, what it feels, what we smell, right? What we hear, what we sense, what we, taste, all those kind of things. The five senses, all those things. Anything that it identifies with, the concepts, notions, history, you name it, anything, that is really identification. So anywhere you have it, it's of course identification. We've seen this time and time again. If you look at any postings, it's what it is. But how does this tie into the whole picture? Well, we're going to go through kind of like I would say the evolutionary process of the whole thing, how it's, we're becoming more aware. Because to me, personally, I feel like this switch that's happening, these changes that are happening with the age of Aquarius, ties in with where it's opposite of. Right? If you look at Aquarius, its opposite sign is Leo. So that means at least the development, or rather you can say the birth of the ego is identification, or more like the unconsciousness. Because, if you look at animals, everything else, they're present. They're in connection with. And this isn't just like awareness, I know. This isn't just awareness, oh, I've had experience, therefore I know. This isn't just I've had the experience, I know, and therefore I kind of understand. This is like connection, like really connected. This is what Eckhart talks about when he said, it's bringing the vertical. Was it the vertical with the horizontal? We're in the horizontal, and having that vertical, I mean, the ego has always kind of misunderstood the vertical because it wants to interpret things for itself. That's part of interpretation, right? Interpretation is identification because it wants to interpret for itself. This is why we've been said we are actually ego centric. We're focused on the self, and this isn't about bad or good. Okay, forget that whole shit. Okay, but the reason why there is a duality is because the ego separates itself. It is separative. It tends to be separative, but that's an unhealthy ego. If you look at the ego itself as its defense mechanism, it's survival, right? But so that's rooted in something else. If you look at the process of how planets are formed, or a solar system is formed, what happens? Kaboom! Right, the sun, a star basically. Okay, the sun is a star. It explodes, and from it comes its birth. From it actually comes debris. I don't know what that's called, but there's just like dust and debris around, usually a lot of stars. in the early years, in the early stages, right? And eventually those dust clump up and they become bigger things. Then those form your meteors, or whatever you want to call asteroids, whatever, and then planets. Okay. However they form is depending on what's happening there. I personally don't believe in like coincidences, because there's a reason why in our solar system it's tied to, there's a link between what we've discovered in the astronomical data about all these things, how we see it in astrology, and how it's perceived psychologically. So with that being said, you have the sun exploding. So aspects of it start to form. If you think about just the idea of forming the dust debris around a star, forming, it's not only symbolism, but I feel it's really connected to the awareness of, oh, there must be that aspect of myself. Right? Process that for a bit. There's that aspect of myself. And linking this to how the older planets are actually further out into the solar system. The newer planets are the ones that are further inside. I was like, how does that make sense? Well, think about if you remember physics, if you studied physics, it's called centrifugal force, right? You spin something in something like a pencil or something, and then you spin it. So, for example, I have this thing, right? This is centrifugal force, right? But basically, what's holding it in here is right? So I'm going to stop it for a second here. So basically, my finger was the actual force pulling it in. That's gravity. In other words, attraction. In other words, magnetism. In other words, that's a thing. That's when you're pulling something to the center. That's what it is. It's towards the center because it wants to know. That's part of the whole. I feel like it's tied strongly, instinctively feel. I trust this one. I don't care if anybody agrees or not. So don't waste your time. The whole, like, it's something to do with like part of the consciousness process, part of its awareness of itself. Whether or not we're actually awakened to that process, it's more like, oh, I have at least an identity. That's part of the process as well, because when you identify with something, let's say you didn't know this thing, like a child, right? If you look at it from a child's like a baby, a toddler, it's just putting things in its mouth. It's curious. But it's not curious the way we see it. It's just like, it's exploring. That's part of a natural process. It's exploring that is not necessarily about curiosity, like I want to know. It's just that it's experiencing. How do you explain why in astrology we go through the signs and fires first? Fire is that sort of curiosity. It just knows to go for something. It just goes. It's this, and so it's funny because it then ties into intuition and how it goes. It just knows what to do. Not necessarily in terms of like, if there's a problem, it doesn't create problems, right? Same thing with other animals. They just go for things. And it's instinct, intuition as one thing. And it's in the body, right? And then it experiences, that's the earth part. Then it starts to gain knowledge about what these things are. When I say knowledge, I don't mean like, oh, information, it's just numbers. We're not fucking talking about symbols, okay, and all those and letters and all those things. I mean knowledge, it's just like, and that sort of knowing, oh, 'cause if I do this, this will happen. If I do this, so this part, it's linked directly to that experience, right? So, but we're not looking at it from the signs, but at the same time, it's good to look at it from an entire holistic perspective. So you have the sun, right? It's very much to itself. It's all about like, I want to know, I want to experience, because it's more for the self. It's more for like, you know, they want, there's this desire to understand its identification. There's a desire for it to understand existence. There's a desire for it. It's like that's what the sun is also. It's a desire. It's want, because it's like it's kind of like the precursor to curiosity. Because curiosity, I feel like that's more of a Mercury thing, because it's like it's rooted in knowledge, because it had that experience. So the experience is the desire. The curiosity is the aftermath from that. It's like, oh, I've experienced this, so now I want more. Right? So there's that pull of the sun. There's that energy of like, I have this vitality, I have this energy, I have this like. So that's what really shining is. You just want to do something. You want to experience. You want to play. You want to do things. It's, you know, there's a reason why it rules Leo. Right? He wants to do this. He wants to do this. He wants to just go out there. He wants to shine. And it goes. That's why its light beams out even past all the way to Sedna, as far as we know, in terms of how far we've seen, and how what the furthest planetary body is. So, right? So this is why it's identity, because it's like, if you go into yourself, you go deep into yourself, and you go into really, really deep, like deeper than deeper than deeper than deeper than deeper than deeper than deeper. I know that's extreme, but that's the way it works. It's you start to get to know things, right? So we're not looking at it from this linear perspective, as it's like the sun is where it starts. That's not how it goes. Stars are actually born because there's a collection of energy, right? I don't know how that forms. I'm not a physicist. I'm not an astrophysicist. I'm not an astronomer. Okay, but what I understand from myself is that it's somehow there's this energy from energy or from energy from energy. You know, energy is always transferred. That's what I know. That's what I understand it to be. So stars somehow are born. So this is burst of energy. What came before that, I don't think it matters, because we're looking at it from that really this perspective, three-dimensional. It's like it has to be just linear from this to this, consequence, like action, consequence. We're stuck in that, right? And that's not a bad thing. It's just if we want to go further than that, then we have to. That's what this elevation is all about. Matthias de Stefano mentioned that. He said that, you know, really the whole 3D thing, 1D, 2D, 3D, blah, 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 the dimension are not realms. They are perceptions. It's perception. It's how we that's what it is. It's perception. It's elevation of perception. As we go up in perception, we also start to understand these little things. That's why there are people who don't understand certain things, and there are people who do. And it's just part of the natural process of choice. Is also part of the natural process. Choice means, even though you know you can move beyond that, there's a sort of a push. And this is why it's also connected to, you know, being guided. The whole guidance thing is not really separate from you. There's a reason why you probably heard, for some of you, that your guides, your angels never leave you. They're always here. They're always present. And why is that? Because it's connected. It's energy. So therefore, when you make a choice, it's not it could be this separate egoic choice, but it could also be a guided choice, depending on our level of unconsciousness, our level of awareness at the moment. It changes every moment. This is why it now goes back to the whole presence thing. Now is the only reality. Does that make sense? I hope it does. And I don't mean to be condescending. I'm not trying to be condescending. I just feel like I think that we've come to this point where just many humans, many of us are so caught up in labels, and that's not a bad thing. It's just, again, when I made a video earlier, about separation and wholeness, that's what the whole thing is. Wholeness is accepting that and then really being present and actually completely accepting it and then growing from there. See, that's kind of vague right now for many of you, but I'll explain that for another time. But it's really, when we start the process to seeing our wholeness as we've seen it from how we're, at the very least brainwashed to break things down so much and then putting back the pieces together like a puzzle piece, right? I mean, that in itself, I feel, is part of the whole evolutionary process. That it's like we have to break things down in order to understand it. It's like tinkering away. It's like an instrument. You take out a part and then you're like, okay, what's this? Right? And then we kind of that. But I feel like that's more like knowledge. What I'm saying is that it has to be experienced first and foremost before the knowledge. Otherwise, we just get knowledge and we don't really understand it. We think we understand. Do you understand? I see this all the time when I teach classes. Of course, it's natural with language classes. They're like, do you understand? Like, yeah, I understand. But what they're saying is not understand. They're saying, I know the definition of what you're saying. I just know it by the words. It's very, very, very robotic. I know it by rote memorization. I know it by what I've been told. I know it by regurgitating what I was told. I know it by, so it's all just pure, just knowledge, not understanding. But real knowledge comes from experience. And you know this. We all know this instinctively. We all know this. So, going back to the whole thing, I digressed a lot there, but it's part of the whole process of awakening. So this whole thing about where the sun is going, right? You can tell right away when I'm doing these things and identify with the Plutonian thing. I have Sun-Pluto conjunct. For those who don't know, it is intensity. It is genuineness. But there's an egoic thing that goes on there too. I project onto people who are not open to that intensity, who are not open to the truth and fucking flaying yourself alive, not literally, but just being open and really being open to that suffering and like using suffering as like, the toxic waste and garbage and viruses and bacteria and death, and then rebirthing yourself from the process by surrendering to powerlessness, because the ego wants to believe it's powerful because it's all scared. And that's the whole thing about the sun. The sun is relating to that ego itself. There's actually more to this than just the sun, right? So I'm just using the planets as a kind of a guide in a way, and a sort of pseudo analogy to where we're headed right now. So with the sun being the focus for the past fucking like 12,000 years, right? Because of Leo, it started with, I would say okay, this is not to be linear, okay? It started with Leo. And, it progressed into, of course, Cancer, which is about family. But because that was the initial point, again, let me reiterate that. Initial point. Can you see this? Hand quotes. It's not literal. It's not actual. We don't know exactly when the ego started. There's no specific. It's like asking a person, when did you realize you're gay? You mean what specific exact time? Which is actually kind of ironic if you think about it. Like in astrology, we have the chart. We have this energy that's stamped onto us when we're born, right? I feel that is just the sort of the basic platform for living. I feel like the chart has something to do more with this is the energy that's there, but it doesn't mean that it's stagnant. It doesn't mean that it's just like that. It means that that's the dominant energy. It doesn't mean that that's what it is, all it is. Similarly, tying this to do you see here the word dominant? I said the word dominant with Leo being the first age that we were in as humans, the recognition of the self-identification, the word dominant there applies as well. Leo is a dominant sign. It's a dominant energy. So therefore we carry that through in terms of like the dominance, right? It's also a masculine energy, meaning it's externally focused. It's like, which is funny because it's external, therefore external identification with the external, not inside, right? So that's what it is. You see how it all kind of ties in? I hope you're getting this one. So you have the Leo thing there, and it kind of just progresses and carries on. Even if you had this whole sort of Cancer, the age of Cancer came through. Okay, Cancer is the moon, right? Okay, sure, whatever. But because of the dominant energies that carried itself forward, it's kind of like when you look at any progression charts, you're still going to have the dominant energy that you were born with, and then you evolve from there. It's kind of like that too. Collectively evolving, going to Cancer, Gemini, Taurus, Aries, and then Pisces was the most recent one we were in. So you see how that ties in with how we evolve. Now we're into Aquarius. So we're going to go back into this one after the Aquarius thing. Eventually, we'll go with the flow here. At least I'm going with my flow. Catch up if you can. If you can't, I'm going to try. Okay? I'm going to try. So the sun, that's where it starts, right? Explodes. Things go from there, right? And you look at the oldest planets, they're further out, and that's what it is. Not because I want you to say, oh, that's just what it is. No, I mean, I want you to kind of process this internally, meditate on it, and figure out, what does it mean? Like, why are you even getting into, for example, if you're into astrology and you're fascinated by these things, it's, I think for me personally, I feel I started in 2010. I got fascinated by it because it provided a sort of like, I knew that instinctively it was going to provide, not really, yes, there's the knowledge thing, but also the mystery behind it was, it was a combination of the left and right brain, which I find was like, oh, that's awesome. It's like, it feels a little whole, right? So, but for people, I think that when we tend to be focused only on the analytical things, intellectual, we're only using the left brain, at the very least, then we get stuck. Right? It's like that whole puzzle piece I said in the other video. I said that when you have, that's the ego, it wants to separate. So therefore it's identifying with one thing and an aspect of the bigger picture. Right? And instead, it's kind of like one of the passions that I have with languages is like just looking at this and say, this is just language and these are the methods. And I'm going to do comprehensible input. And I'm just going to do that. Not realizing that there's a whole bigger fucking picture that it's actually from. This is why even when you're talking about astrology, looking at the sun itself, that's not the whole picture. Same thing with when you see in pop fucking astrology in magazines and newspapers and whatever we had before, and now it's like, oh, this is your blah blah blah, blah blah blah, this is for your ta 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 ta. It's the sun. Great. Okay, so this is like solar star sign astrology, and that's it. Admittedly, I get frustrated with that because it's like, so how is that helping people? How is that really going in depth? Like, how is that helping them move forward? Is it just going to be one of those mundane things where you wake up, brush your teeth, take a dump, take a leak, shower, but have your breakfast, go to work, 9 to 5, done. Okay, repeat, rinse and repeat. I mean, for people today, there's some people who find that that's okay. And again, but eventually humanity, the way things evolve, is like it's bound to change. Change is inevitable. And this is the reason why the change is inevitable. But also stagnancy is also inevitable. It's funny how I say that, because it's like you need stability to help maintain what was a change, what that change was headed towards anyways. Right? It's like a constant, that's flow of life. True, right? Life, death, life, death, life, death. Those are the extremes of it, right? But that's what change is. Now, going back into what I was saying here, it's all tied together. I see the connections. There are probably people who don't. Don't worry about that. The point is, I think eventually you'll see. But I don't know how I just saw it. I just see things. I do. I think this is one of those things I was born with, or at least born in this form with, where I just see things that some other people don't, and it's just like I know the connection, but it's like, so I've always, growing up, I don't understand why people didn't see the connection. Like, for example, you look at the whole pandemic thing. People say, wash your hands, da 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 da, but they only looked at it from like the washing your hands. They looked at it as like, I'm going to just go like this, and then touch the doorknob again where I didn't, that was supposed to. You see that? It's recontamination. I don't see why that cannot be seen by some. You see, but here's the thing. Even though I am projecting towards that, even though I am, it's something that bothers me. Every person has their own evolutionary process. Every person has their own evolutionary experiences. That's what it is. When I say evolutionary, I don't mean like, I've been told this before, that apparently the word evolution is like on a grand scheme thing. But I feel like when I got corrected for that, the person wasn't reading into what I was saying. Or rather, they did not get exposed to communication beyond communication. They just look at the literal surface and like, you mean this, and they go by the definition. They went by the definition, and they said, you mean adaptation. So as a person who was trying to be open, and I was also teaching them, tutoring basically, and I was helping them, I was helping them acquire language. But all they saw, you can tell how if you're an empath, you can tell how robotic people get with the way they talk. Right. So it's like, you're like a textbook. I'm like talking to a textbook. What is this? Right? There's no flow, because again, it's part of that. There's some of us that are just, either you're born that way or you develop that. Either way, that's part of the whole process. There's no such thing as coincidence. There's a reason why that person was someone I met. Okay. So again, I know that I'm digressing, but it is not disconnected. It's connected to this whole thing, because I'm trying to tell you that this is, as I'm giving examples of ego as self, you look into that as well. So the moon obviously is the next thing, right? But how there's a connection between the two. When we look at the ages we've gone through, right? Leo, all those things. And then it went into the moon. It's funny how it's going that way. If you look at the planets, the direction of humanity as a collective is tied to not only the where the sun is and start all the way out, but at the same time, it's all connected to the ages. Isn't that interesting? That's so cool, right? So the age of Leo, the first stage, so to speak, transitioned into the age of Cancer, so moon. But I like to look at things because everything's connected, right? How did that happen? Like what could have transitioned into that? Well, first of all, naturally, if you're looking at it from an anthropological point of view, I'm pretty sure that's when we discovered farming. Or maybe not necessarily farming, but at least the concept of home. That, it's so that families, circles started to become more important. It was the age where, you've seen this all the time. And we're not talking about the ages here. But the fact is that's all about that, right? But again, remember, because of the sun being the genesis of the whole thing, so to speak. Again, the moon became kind of like a secondary thing. And I'm not trying to, want the whole patriarchy thing, but that's basically what probably led to today. Right? You have patriarchy as a rule. It's like a dominant masculine sign. Now you go into the moon, Cancer, 4th house. Negative sign, okay, meaning like inward focused, feminine. And it was like subdued. So there's just still this dominant energy, right? Which makes sense to what happened today. What's happening today still. Like there's this females or women in general are seen as, and still are seen as, secondary to the moon. I'm secondary to the sun. Because even astrologically and astronomically speaking, you look at it, it's like, oh, there's a sun. Okay, it's fucking huge. Okay, good. Whatever. And then the sun is like this little tiny piece of dot right there. And it just revolves around the earth. But if you look at it from where we are, literally from where we are on Earth, the moon is the closest body to the Earth, not the sun. The sun is actually quite a distance away, right? It's just providing light. The moon gets light from the sun. Which this one actually ties in what Teal Swan was saying about how the feminine, or generally women, there's a sort of like the initiative energy of masculine or men. It's an initiative, but it doesn't mean that it's better. But we've had this belief for thousands and thousands of years, or 12,000 years, that it's like that because it was the dominant energy, that it's like so the moon must be just like secondary. See, linear perspective, linear. It's like that's not how it works. That's not how it works. That's not how it is. Fuck that. Okay. If you believe that, good luck to you, but I hope you find the right way. Meaning, right way as in, I hope you find that it's like, that's not how it works. How would you like it if someone made you secondary rather than equal? So, the sun, the moon. So this moon is not obviously secondary. The moon is, right, we know about this, right? The moon is emotions, the moon is fluctuations, mood, basic things, basic needs as well. Food as well ties in with the moon as well. But with the moon, there's complexities in it. And as part of the evolution that we went through and are still going through, at least in the 3D perspective, in the linear perspective, we are... It's funny because I just mentioned the word linear there. I don't mean it like I'm adhering or I'm, what do you call this? I'm dependent on the belief of the fact that it's linear. I'm just stating in the fact that that's linear. These are the things that sometimes when, even though people spell it out, you have to experience it yourself. Because when people say certain things, read between the lines. This is part of also, awareness is not just, I'm waiting for the leaves to fall and the fruits to fall off the tree to give me awareness. Right? No, it's both. Like sometimes it happens to you because you're guided, and you also have to make the choice because there's a part of you that you just know this, like, okay, I am from source, I am from the whole, so therefore I am whole. Why succumb to the separation of like, no, fuck that, I'm not doing that, this is my belief, right? You see that where it ties back into the sun as well? You see how astrologically speaking it ties back into the sun, identity? the moon is somewhat like identity. The moon is going deep into the depths of the self and figuring out the inner self. The moon is the way, that's why it's tied with moods and emotions, because emotions are strong. They're actually tied into why we have come to, or why we experience, I was going to say mood swings here, but why we experience this whole sometimes we just need to separate ourselves to process things, not because we don't want people around us, but because we want to just, moon, I would say people with, like, introverted people, they probably have strong moon placements in their charts because they're emotionally, they're inwards. We're going inwards, or at least strong those negative signs in their chart, because they're more internal. They go inwards, right? They're highly perceptive. And speaking of perception, this is why women tend to be the whole 50 steps ahead, because it's internal. But the moon is also defensiveness, right? And even though we call it, like, sometimes I feel like sometimes we use astrology and the planets itself and astronomy, astronomically speaking, the planets as a sort of an analogy to the process. That I don't believe that. I believe that the movement of the planets coincide directly with the energies of collective consciousness, at least on Earth, but other bodies as well, other entities and other guides and past civilizations. Aliens, call it aliens, okay, our galactic family, all those things and more. Okay, it's all connected. There's a reason why astrology was introduced in the first place. Right? So, I mean, it's very interesting because it's like, if you look at the moon itself, going back to how it's tied to perception, being perceptive, and women are like, is because of the analogy that the moon wasn't actually the moon but was before, when the Earth was, according to the research, or at least the video I saw from National Geographic. I don't know the science behind this, but they said that the moon was formed when this called the imaginary planet bumped into Earth, early Earth, right? And then collided, but that smaller planet, they called her Theia. I believe that Theia, or at least Theia, or maybe Leto, I think the equivalent, the Greek word is Leto, was the mother of Artemis, or rather Diana, so the moon. Right, so I don't know, but they called her Theia. There's something to do with that energy. I'm not into here to prove to you anything else. I'm just saying that because of that thing, what happened, it crashed and it became just debris outside, but the Earth's gravity was actually pulling in these debris, and it just circled around the Earth. So it became, planet Earth actually had rings for millions of years before the moon started becoming like this collection and started becoming this massive object called the moon. And throughout time, the moon has actually been this protector. It's actually taken, if you look at the moon's surface today, there's a lot of craters. Craters? They're called craters? Yeah. So it's taken a lot of damage from asteroids. So that represents a lot of the protective nature of the moon, why it's tied in with Cancer. It's very protective, it's very nurturing, it's mothering, right? That ties in also with the asteroids Diana and Artemis. They're all about protection. Right? But it's also about the wildest, the inner wildest in us. And if you look at it, it's like, well, wild, isn't that sort of like tied with primordialism or primordial things? So wild meaning like wild, right? Like instinct, wild, carnal. Well, isn't the sun older than that? Well, yeah, but remember again, the moon was the closest body to is the closest body to Earth, not the sun, even though the sun's energy is huge. And at the same time, the moon is more solid than the sun. I believe it is. But the sun is mostly gas, right? If you look at the research on it, do your research on it. I believe that the moon has more solid mass than gas. So that means it's a lot heavier. It's not like gassy, okay? It's not light. It's heavier, has more mass. So that in itself contributes to the fact that the moon in us, our inner moon, affects us, and it's that energy of protection. It's that energy of preservation, creating boundaries. That's why it's also the ruling planet of Cancer. Crab, right? Thick shells, protection, defensiveness, right? And there's different aspects of that too. It's not just the asteroid. Why is the moon tied with the north and south nodes? Soul, right? I've learned before that the sun is the spirit, whilst the moon is the soul. The spirit is that whole childlikeness. Spirit is like, okay, I just want to experience. I just want. Remember, I told you earlier, it's like it just wants to, like it's a baby. He wants to put things in his mouth. It's very, very curious, right? Childlike, beautiful thing. And the moon is a part of us that wants to go beyond that and see, like, I still want to experience, but like wants to now it's understanding that it's like, oh, I need to be a little bit more like, you know, physically aware at the very least, and instinctive, because it starts to notice its environment. It starts to go, okay, what's going on here? So it looks for a way to protect itself. And as a young person, or as a toddler maybe, or as a young child, you start to notice its emotions, start to go, who are these people older than me? What's that? They look bigger than me, so they must be able to protect me. So this concept of the moon is just like instinctive desire, or the needs, it's a need, to be protected by those around you, caretakers, guardians, parents, whatever. Right? So anyone around you in your current vicinity, it's that whole feeling of protection. It's that instinctive understanding, that sort of like acceptance and understanding that that's what it is. When I say acceptance, I literally mean that that's part of it, because the moon is also about magnetism. So it's a reception. Emotion is receptive, right? If you put things in water, moon is tied to water, right? Cancer. If you put things in water, what happens? It has no choice but to mix it with that, whether it's good for the water or bad for the water. Vitamins or poison, what do you put in the water? As an example, right? So, okay. You mix it, it has no choice but to go with that. It's adaptation, right? But there's another aspect to that. Oh, sorry, going back to the nodes though, how that ties in with the soul, it ties in with like its process. So there's a reason why the moon is the fastest moving, not only because it's because it revolves around the earth the fastest, but it has a lot to do with the soul's constant change. Right? Water changes, but it also remembers. You know, water, there's research on it now. I think the research was started in Japan or something like that, where if you have an intention and you are in water, or somehow you set the attention towards water, you can actually change the frequency of the water. Or at least it remembers your intention. It remembers the environment around it. That's why the moon is tied to that. The moon is receptivity, magnetism, emotional ups and downs, sensitivity, okay, water, all those kind of things. You'll see it. Whatever the moon is, there's many like descriptions of water, of the moon. Sorry. So when we get in touch with both the sun and the moon, we start to feel like, oh, there's this aspect of identity, but the sun is more about the identity. The moon is it's the understanding. Like knowing versus understanding. The sun is just mostly about surface stuff. It's like, oh, I just know it. I just experience it. But absorbing it, that's where the moon comes in. The moon is the whole like but it takes its process as well. So that's where the nodes come in, because it's process, it's soul process. Past, future, past, future, past, future, and always in the present. I think the sun is more like in the present right here, whereas the nodes are out here. But the moon is also tied in with that. There's this interesting like cosmic dance that happens between the two planets, but it's nodes as well. So it's because, it's weird, because if you look at like how women tend to go through things, because it's memory, people with good like Cancer placements, especially Mercury in Cancer, good memory, awesome memory, they will not forget things, or at least they will remember most things. Even Cancer, even Mercury in any of the water signs, it's pretty much the same thing. They remember a lot of things. I have Mercury in Scorpio. It's water. I remember a lot of things. There are things I just kind of just like probably has embedded. That's for another time. So, so again, the nodes, where it's the process of the past and the future, but also in the present. The moon it's tied to, the nodes are tied to the moon. Like there's the asteroid stuff are tied to the moon. And you're like, okay, what the heck does that have to do with anything, right? But if you look at it, it's the soul process. It's learning from the past, living in the, trying to be in the present, but still thinking about the future. This is the complexity of the moon. This is the complexity of why, in general, women are like that. And that's part of the whole process. Even our inner femininity, if we tap into it, we'll understand more and like, really go fucking deep. We'll start to feel that. I don't know, maybe it's just me. I don't know. I feel like, I'm not saying I understand women, but as a gay man, it's like kind of close to that. Not saying exactly close to that, but kind of close to it, I would say. But I don't think it has anything to do with my being gay. I think it's sort of a past life thing. It's my experience. I did past life regressions. I've done some past life regressions. It was amazing. I saw myself as a woman. I was pregnant. I don't know what happened to the child. I didn't look further into that. But, right? And, yeah. So, going back to the nodes, it's looking into that whole like, this is the past and this is the future. So, and then the moon carries it. It's part, there's a reason why the nodes are tied to the moon. It's part of the lunar self, right? 4th house, Cancer. Imam Kweli as well, the inner self. Then there's the dark side of it. Lilith. Even Lilith has its own complexities. Lilith has its own, there's the asteroid Lilith, which is apparently the more of the early stages, which I believe is the initial part, which can be tied almost like the past, to the past. It could be, and then there's the oscillating Lilith, the mean Lilith, and then there's a Waldemoth Lilith. So there's technically 4 types of Lilith. But that shows how the complexity of Lilith is in terms of the processing. Again, see the moon, process. So Lilith is tied to that. But Lilith is the shadow. I read this word once, that if Pluto is the masculine side, the energy of shadow, Lilith is the other one. Is the feminine side. So when I say, I believe what that really means is kind of like the shadow that's tied in, physiologically speaking, the left and the right brain. Right? I don't know, to me it makes sense. So Lilith is that dark side. It's the fears behind it. Because the moon has its fears, our inner moon has its fears, we get defensive. That inner processing of the shadow is the truth of what that is. This is why it's tied to Pluto as well. Lilith is tied to Pluto, like hell, right? Hell is the processing of darkness. Hell is the processing of why we have this duality. The processing of many, 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 many things. Okay, but definitely shadow. So you see how it's all interesting here, but the moon, the these things that came about when we started realizing that the moon is more complex than it is. Like the sun has asteroids, like related to it. Like there's Eos is related to the sun. I would say Orpheus is kind of related to the sun, something to do with that. But Apollo for sure is related to the sun. Helios, I believe Helios is a moon though. Not sure if Helios is an asteroid. Either way, the sun is already too big as it is to have any, subordinates, so to speak. So with the moon, that's what it is. It makes it complex, right? So the moon is a part of the processing of the self. Not necessarily identity itself, but kind of, right? It's tied into that. That's why it's a shadow. The way I see it now, it's like literally right now, is that there's a reason why the shadow is, there's a link between the shadow and the moon as well. Because with the identity itself and being kind of like, this is my belief, there's a defensiveness to the sun as well. But it's more about being right. I want to be right. And it gets defensive. That defensiveness is reflected in the moon. Right? It goes like, oh, and it gets defensive. But when it has no time to or opportunity to defend itself, it goes inwards. It processes the emotion. That's where the whole, are we learning from the lesson, north nodes, right? And the whole processing of the shadow, really it's tied into the moon. So this is how complex the moon is. It doesn't mean that it's crazy or that it's just, whatever you want to call it. That's just what it is. Part of our evolutionary process. Again, evolutionary, I don't mean I don't mean to belittle the terms they use in anthropology and science. But to be honest, that's not my point right now. So, okay? So Mercury. So how do we transition into the Mercury thing? Again, looking at the ages. Got the age of Leo, age of Cancer, and then we got the age of Gemini. Right? Makes sense with the Mercury there. Right? The Mercury is next in line in terms of after the sun. It's funny how the moon is technically after the sun because it's kind of like its counterpart. Okay, yeah, it's its counterpart. You can say that as well. With the Mercury, it's that actual expression. It's the expression, but it's also expression of impression. That's why we have these impressions of what we think that thing is. Mercury is basically like the brain, right? If you look at Egyptian mythology, who was it that was the god of knowledge or wisdom or something like that? Was it Hathor? Don't remember who it was. Anyways, he was symbolized apparently by the brain or something like that. Anyways, so the Mercury is basically that. The brain is the perception of reality. It's the mind, basically, right? We already know that about Mercury, but I feel like because it's part of self-expression, you see how the word self-expression is tied to that? Again, because of the dominant energies that were started or initiated through the age of Leo. That's what Mercury is. We started getting to know things, we started to experience that it's but it was more about the experience of home stuff, because of the age of Cancer and and the idea of the unit, the idea of collective, or at least the small collective. Back in more than 12,000 years ago, maybe 8,000 years ago, or rather 10,000 years ago, no, 8,000 years ago, approximately, maybe. Again, this isn't about the exact numbers, so don't waste your time trying to say, not exact, okay, leave it. So 8,000, maybe approximately 8,000 years ago, at the age of Gemini, it carried on from it. These experiences and started to know, it's oh, okay. There's the family unit, and then there's the identity. But where do I go from here? Because when you have expression, and impression, you want to relate, right? That's why it's Gemini. It's transmission, communication, with, right? So, right? So, you, me thing. So, it's kind of the start of relationships in a way. It's a precursor to Venus. Because Mercury is not just transmission, it's not just transmission of information, it's relating. But it's more like relating information, or rather relating the knowledge or potentially the understanding of the experienced. What was experienced, what is experienced. In terms of its evolution, I believe that Mercury, it helps us to not just perceive things as they are, but to not just understand them. It's quite light. And the reason why, like, if you look at your inner Mercury, it's all about the talking and the blah, 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 and all that mind stuff, right? It's very airy, like the Gemini thing, right? But the thing is, it has a flexibility to it. There's a reason why he was called the god of Mercury was the messenger god. Because he was able to be flexible and adaptable, just like Gemini. Right? The age of Gemini, it's all about adaptiveness, having that adaptive abilities. Right? That's why he was also the messenger god, but also he helped to send the dead to the afterlife. So what does that say? If you're looking at it from an evolutionary point of view and tying into astrology and psychologically speaking, why was he the messenger god? I mean, why was he like Anubis in Egyptian mythology? Why was he like that? Why is it in mythology? Why is it described like that? Hermes, Mercury, whatever, same thing. Well, if you think about it, it's going into the deeper depths of further out into beyond just knowing. Right? So Mercury is a transitionary. Right? Mercury is not just expression, but why is it expression? Because you're talking about individual to collective, or individual to others. Mercury is in between there. It's expression. Right? So it's transmission, but also transition. Right? So there's a reason why, if you look at Uranus, which is the high vibration of Mercury, Uranus is tied to bisexuality. I would say also pansexuality, because it's this way. It's here to here, here to here. So it's this transition, right? And this explains why it's also tied to communication and who's the messenger god. Because if you look at this, the revolution of Mercury around the sun, it's the fastest. So it processes information quickly, right? But for some reason, not as quickly, but it's continuous. There's always flow. Mercury likes flow. This is by when Mercury is the only. It's the first planet amongst, in terms of the order of the planets where it's going. Mercury is the first one to retrograde. The sun and the moon don't retrograde, as you may already know. So, yeah. And that also makes it the fact, because it's light, because it's fast, it ties in with the whole, it's light thing. So the age of Gemini is the most flexible sign in the zodiac. It's the most flexible energy you could ever have. Teal Swan is Gemini. Oh, is it she Gemini? I don't remember. I thought he was Gemini. I forgot. Maybe she's Cancer. I don't remember. I have to look back into her chart. But anyways, that's the point. The point is that the inner Mercury is. So transitioning to Venus, it's funny because of transition, right? Mercury transitions to Venus, is that it carries over its process of relating. It's funny because actually Mercury, I don't know if Mercury has ties with Nemesis. I'm not sure. Not going to go into that one. But okay, so let's go into Venus, right? Venus has an asteroid equivalent to it, it's Aphrodite. So we go into the age of Taurus. But remember, don't forget that the dominant energy was from the age of Leo, so it's still about self. So if the moon is self-innerness, self-processing, the Mercury is self-expression. Venus is self-relating. It's relating Venus to itself. This is why Venus it ties in with jealousy. Aphrodite is very similar. Venus is the whole I want to relate with you, but because it's tied in with the past, this is what we're learning about this whole thing about from the age of Leo. Again, the starting point, okay? The dominant energy, it's self-relating. So it actually still starts from the self. So Venus likes to charm and seduce. It likes to, because it's trying to get for itself. And it's not about, again, this is not about good or bad. It's just Venus is that way. Venus, our inner Venus, wants to get something for something. It's a trade. But it's physical transmission, not brain connected. Well, kinda. But there's a part of it where Venus is, I'm going to transmit. It's a little bit more towards me now. How does it benefit me? This is where the word benefit, it kind of ties in a little bit with Venus, because the benefit is something about worth. This is why Venus rules self-worth. You see that self-worth, not general worth, self-worth, value, self-value rather, right? It's what we appreciate things, it's what makes us. So it's kind of like the baby learning from its experience, like the whole, okay, so I know from its moon, and then it's like experienced and had this sort of inner knowledge or experience, just like knowledge itself, which is like now Mercury. Now when it goes into Venus, now it goes into like, I forgot to mention that with the age of Gemini, this is when we started to relate with our first friends, which is siblings, which is tied into what? Siblings. Mercury is also tied in with youthfulness, right? That sort of youthfulness thing. But once we get into Venus, it's almost like it's grown up. The child has grown up and it starts to relate with other people, but because it's already gone past the whole like, okay, I have my siblings, my first friend. But what if you didn't have siblings? Okay. Like if you have any sort of Venus where I think if it's tied in any solitary planet or solitary asteroids, if Venus is tied in with that in, I would say, any of the houses, especially with the third house, because that's about siblings. The Mercury is not really about siblings. Like the planets, the way they work in astrology is not exactly like the signs. It's the signs that are more tied in with the houses, but they all kind of work, they have their own different functions, they kind of work differently, so they're not completely the same, at least traditionally speaking. But it is that if you meditate on it, if you really process your inner Venus, you'll see it's like, oh, it's what you value, it's what you, so you'll come to see what each planet means for you. Especially if you look at your own experiences, like, what does it mean? What did I do? But remember, astrology is not like, let's break things down and just focus on one thing at a time. Or rather, focus on that only. But it's more about, okay, we got this and and then we add it, you kind of want to just add it right away. Meaning what I mean by that is if you say have Venus and Moon conjunct, for example, there could be many meanings to that. Depending on where it's at, what sign it's at, is it close to, right? So I think many people are noticing this now. But the point I'm making right now is in terms of like why it's important to have this a different awareness of your own inner Venus. And that makes astrology a lot more interesting and more fun, because it's like not just fun, but more like it gives it a lot more purpose. It's like your inner Venus, right? If you think about inner Venus, it's almost like you're going, okay, now I understand it. I feel like because of that experience, because you've already had that experience, therefore you know you understand it. You just kind of bring it up to the surface and you're going, what is that? What was that? What does it mean to me? Right? So Venus is always about relationships, but it's more about because value. But what does value mean in terms of how it ties in with relationships? Because if we value ourselves, it kind of exudes out, into. It's basically tied in with the seventh house. It's tied in with shadow, or rather, projection, which is a part of shadow work, right? It's projection. If we don't honor our inner Venus, meaning our own self-worth, what'll happen is we'll become manipulative. That's a whole another shebang and ball, another like can of worms that can happen when we don't do that. But as children, though, sometimes we're just not aware of that. Most children are not. Most children are just like, they just want to explore. And that's where the sun goes, we go back into the sun. It wants to explore, it wants to be curious, it wants to relate. Once you see a child relating with their classmates in school, that's the Venus thing. Then it experiences like suppression, repression, bullying, or openness, and like camaraderie, all those things. It experiences those things. Venus is tied to Taurus. Yes, Libra, but we're not going to get into that one. It's tied to Taurus, and Taurus likes the simple things. Taurus likes simplicity, likes relating with people in a very simple, that feeling of artistry, that feeling of like, I can just create. It ties in back into the sun. The sun is our creativity, but also ties in with the moon, which is I would say your inner creativity. It's instinct. It's like, how do I understand what this means for me? Am I just creating out of nowhere? What does it, how do I understand this? What is the meaning behind this? It's creating purpose. And we're like, okay. Then goes back into Mercury. And it's like, now I can sort of now I can know what that understanding is. You cannot know until you understand first. You have to understand first before knowing, like real knowledge. But you have to experience first before you understand. So it's very interesting. Experience starts with the sun. But then we would solidify that by doing things that are hands-on. Like Taurus is like that. So that's why it's tied to Venus. So we have this thing where it's like Venus is going, I want to relate with you, I want to relate with you. What is it? This is why when you relate with people, you see how it's like it's still first and then you. Meaning it's like you go to someone because internally what's happening and subconsciously is like, what do they have? What's in it for me? Not in a, it's like I'm going to manipulate you. But it can eventually lead to that if the benefit becomes completely twisted. Relating with people is relating with people. That's one thing. But it's another thing when you're relating with others and then egoic tendencies get passed on. Even relating with like your own family, your home, parents, siblings, right? So that's the whole part of the process where it's like, okay, that person is not for me. So there you go. See, not for me goes back to the sun thing, but it's still Venus. Venus carries that energy from the sun because all the planets come from the sun. So you see what I mean? So when it's the self thing, so self is the concern always, but how to work with that is the healthier version so that we have a healthier ego rather than this whole corrupted, manipulative, narcissistic, that actually causes more damage, blame, you name it, all of it, right? Defensiveness and these things. So it's transmission as well. Transmission going this and this, but it's less flexible because this is the reason why Venus is tied with Taurus. It's complete opposite. Now we go from Gemini, age of Gemini, to age of Taurus, which is like the energy of Taurus is the most stubborn energy in the zodiac. Okay, so because it needs to build ground, it needs to create that foundation We know that it knows how to experience, like okay, I know how to experience, but now what is it for me? For that feeling of what is in it for me, value, right? If you sense in yourself value, you look at that emotion, you go deep, meditate on it, be like, you'll sense like, oh, value. What is that? Like if you even just look at externally, like, why do I value a book? Why do I value a car? Why do I value this house? Why do I value people? Why do I value this? What is it? Where does that come from? When we value something, we see it as important, meaning it's important for me so that I can make use of it. Use is tied to using hands. You know, when you call somebody, you call your friend, what happens? Usually, most of the time, we call them because we want something. Ties back into the sun, yes, or we need something. It's still like that. It's kind of like the moon as well. But it's toward the benefit of the self, because that's what it is. It's self-worth, it's self-value. We call them purpose, reason. We have I'm calling because I want to talk to. There's always a reason for the most part, right? But the thing about Venus is also the planet of love. When I say love, it's a human love, yes. But Venus also learns how to. It continuously learns how to be, and this ties in with Taurus. People are Taurus. One of the features they have is flexibility, change, scary. Right? If not scary, if not like traumatic. So when we relate with others, it's like I need to feel like I can love myself, so that it's projected onwards. This is again why it's tied into the projection itself, which is part of shadow work, or a component of shadow, right? Because I don't see it in myself. So when you don't see it in yourself, then you mirror. It's a mirror effect. It's like, okay, so they must be providing love for me. Right? But that love can be transcended by saying, this is why Neptune is the high vibration of Venus. It's transcending that belief of the earthly love. But there's a potential for Venus to do that. Our inner Venus wants to. It actually, inner Venus does teach us about love at a basic level, but to transcend that, we would need to see that, okay, they don't need to provide the self-worth, love, and value for me. I can find it by seeing the reality. That's tied to Earth, that's tied to Taurus. Right? So Venus is that energy. It's that love of, in this case, love meaning like appreciation. This is why it's called value as well. It's appreciation. It starts there. Gratitude is related to that as well. This is why there's a beauty in appreciating the little things. Right? Taurus can do that. Instead of the shadow of it, the dark side, the shadow of appreciation is overvaluing, possessiveness. I can't let this go because it's like I bought it. It's my worth. If you steal it, it's like, so right there, it's like, So inner Venus is that whole. It's self-worth. Really, it's tied to self-worth. Right. So how that ties back into how the sun was, because now it's like the sun, if it experiences all those things through the age of Leo, it's carried over that collective, grand, like collective energy for thousands of years into the age of Taurus, or in this case, Venus. Because it experienced corruption. But if we didn't know how to deal with that as a collective, through the moon, through processing in the shadow, because back then we didn't have that, right? There were some that were awakened. There were probably a few, very, very little few, that knew that that doesn't make sense. Okay? It's separation. Which is funny because if you look at it, the direction of where you look at, if you look at the sun and all the way the other planets, the further you get away from yourself, yes, there's a potential for awakening, but it also means there's a there's a potential for being disassociated with disaccepting of self, or an inacceptance of self, meaning not working with your foundation so that you can rise above that self and still appreciate that self. See, there you go, the Venus thing is coming through. And then, right, we have that distance away from, like, as far as probably like Sedna. And we look at the ego, but the ego still has its effects even as far as that, because that becomes cosmic egoicness. That's why there are people out there who have, they're like, this is my belief, that I'm right with this one. This is right. Even astrology does that too. So the ego can make use of that if it is not addressed, if its desires are not addressed, if it's like, why? The moon is part of that too, naturally. If you don't address the true desires, Lilith especially, Lilith for the moon is like our inner, like, it's like that carnal side, the darkness within. So, if we don't embrace that, what happens? Monster in the fucking closet wants to come out because we suppressed it, we locked it in. And that's what's been happening for thousands of years, right? So the Venus, our inner worth, was locked in, and it didn't know how to work with that corruption or the feeling of, I didn't understand this, I don't understand what's this, I just want simple things, I just want to experience things. But then it's like, relationships, right? So I'm gonna be back here for a second. I'm actually gonna go do something, and I'll see you in with Mars.